In this section, we're going to begin our venture into discovering the way postfix handles relaying. Now, one of the most important features of a mail server is its ability to control relaying. And by default nowadays, MTAs deny relaying to domains that are not considered to be local and to hosts that are not also considered to be a part of the local subnet. Let's take a look at the way postfix implements relaying by default. We've authenticated, and we'll open a console session, and we'll show you the main directives that control the way postfix handles relaying. We'll close this login and cancel the console screen. Let's just close all the tabs that are here. And this is as a result of previous logins. Let's minimize the browser and open a console. Now, as I've mentioned, postfix will relay by default domains that are considered to be local, and those are determined by the domains that are specified in the main.cf file. Unlike SendMail, there isn't a local file which contains a list of domains, although we could define a local file and have postfix look up that information. Now let's take a look at our host name in fully qualified domain name format. What's important about this fully qualified domain name is that postfix by default, like other MTAs, will accept messages destined to users at the fully qualified domain name that we currently have highlighted, which is linuxcbtsuzyserv1.linuxcbt.internal. That's a given. Postfix will accept messages to this particular fully qualified domain name because it's considered local. In addition, if you define additional domains and using the MyDestination configuration directive, postfix will also permit relaying to those domains as well. Simply running a postconf and piping it to lest will show you what domains you're currently considering as local. Now, the way postfix demarks or specifies or indicates local versus remote SMTP domains is based on what's defined in the default MyDestination directive. The MyDestination directive is right here, and it's defined as my hostname. My hostname is actually linuxcbtsuzyserv1.mydomain. So mail to this domain will be accepted. Localhost is also considered a local domain that will relay messages for. And last but not least, my domain, which we included a few videos back so that we can handle messages destined or addressed to user at linuxcbt.internal. So these are the domains that we'll handle messages for. Any other domains are considered to be domains that need to be relayed. So if, for example, if someone tries to use, a remote client attempts to use our postfix server for relaying messages out, let's say, to a foreign domain such as linuxcomputerbasedtraining.com, postfix will only permit relaying if the client who's attempting to relay is a member of the networks defined by my networks. Now, there are two key directives that control relaying initially: my networks and my network style. My network style by default is set to subnet. It can alternatively be set to class, whether to match classes A, B, or C from TCP/IP, which is by today's standards considered to be too broad and too liberal, and can lead to unnecessary or unsolicited relaying. It can also relay based on just a given host. If we specify my network style equals host, then postfix will only permit relaying from the local host. It can also permit relaying using the subnet, and that's what's defined by default. So the default is to permit relaying from the local subnet, which is the loopback subnet 127, as well as from the locally connected subnet. Now, the postfix server has an IP address on the subnet 192.168.1.0/24. So any of the hosts that are connected to this subnet will be permitted to relay messages off our postfix server and perhaps out to remote SMTP servers. Now, you may consider that to be too liberal a policy, so we'll change it up shortly to show you how it all works. Let's take a look at attempting to relay from a remote system. Now, we have the Windows 2003 host on the network that we can connect to using the remote desktop connection utility. It's configured in our history, and it's accessible using the RDP protocol. We'll connect to it, and we're going to connect at a custom resolution so that it fits within our window. We'll authenticate as the user administrator with a simple password of ABC123, at which point we'll launch the Outlook Express email client, and we'll configure Outlook Express to relay using the postfix server. So now we're in Outlook Express. Ignore the POP3 error because we don't have the POP retrieval server configured on our SUSE Enterprise box, so it'll return an error invariably. Let's go properties of the only defined profile here, which is labeled as localhost, and we'll navigate to the server section. Now we have remnants from our sendmail session where we set up SMTP auth, so we'll remove my server requires authentication, and we'll ensure that the outgoing mail server is linuxcbt suzyserv1.linuxcbt.internal. Now just because the name says one thing doesn't mean that it resolves to the proper IP address, so it's always due diligence to attempt to resolve the address of the server that's specified by name from the given client, because the given client may be connected to a different DNS server which returns a different IP address for a given host. So from the Windows box, simply execute an NS lookup of linuxcbt suzyserv1.linuxcbt.internal, and this should return an IP address of 192.168.1.30, and it does, indicating that we will be relaying or attempting to relay off the primary enterprise box that's connected to our network running postfix. So now that this is in place, let's press OK, and we'll first begin by relaying a message into the SUSE Enterprise system. Now the SUSE Enterprise box accepts messages destined to a few names, including the fully qualified name as I've specified, as well as any user at linuxcbt.internal, because we've specified as such with the my domain and my destination directives. So let's send a message to root at linuxcbt.internal, and we'll say testing inbound in our subject, testing inbound relay. Now this shouldn't defy any relaying rules, because the domain linuxcbt.internal terminates at the server, so it shouldn't be considered a breach or an attempt to relay to an outside host. It's typically of concern when a client attempts to use one server to relay a message to another server. Let's click send, and when we do send and receive, it sends the message because it's no longer in the outbox. Now we can confirm that the message was delivered by tailing var log mail and examining the contents of the log. We'll look at entries that closely match or are close to the current time of 1724. And here's a connection from 192.168.1.50. The message was received from the network using the SMTP daemon, was fed to the cleanup process. The cleanup process checked all the names, did any rewriting if necessary, and then fed it into the incoming queue where the queue manager picked up, and the message was then further relayed to the box, to the local box of root. So we can confirm that all of this transpired by launching MUD as we've done, and here's the message, testing inbound relay. So there's nothing fantastic about this. This should work. And in fact, our client still echoes a subdomain that we had set up some point ago. So in fact, let's change that now to just simply be at linuxcbt.internal. We'll go properties, and the email address shows up as cs.linuxcbt.internal. We'll just make it linuxcbtw2k3 at linuxcbt.internal. So subsequent messages will appear as such. But nonetheless, the message has been routed inbound. However, what if we wanted to relay to a different system? Let's attempt to do that. So now from our Outlook Express client, we'll create a message and send it to linuxcbt suzy1 at linuxcbtwork1.linuxcbt.internal. So now we're using the server to route messages, or to route this message to the SUSE professional box. So now we can say in our subject, testing relay to a secondary system, because now we're going to ask the server to relay to another system. And again, the server has accepted our message. It's not in our inbox here. If we quit and clear screen and re-examine the contents of the log, the most recently created entries, you'll see that the message was relayed. Our email address has been updated, and it was relayed to 192.168.1.72 or linuxcbt work1. So in a separate shell, if we SSH as root over to 192.168.1.72, we'll authenticate and then launch mutt. There's the new message which was relayed, and the root message was copied, by the way, to the Linux CBT SUSE 1 account on the remote system. And we know that because if we grep root from etc aliases, you'll see that root gets routed. So the message was actually sent to the remote system, and in fact, let's just double check that sendmail or postfix is running on a remote system. It is, and we can tail var log mail on Linux CBT work 1, and the message was received and routed to Linux CBT SUSE 1. So the alias is set up on the remote system to route messages, and in fact we're looking at the etc aliases. Let's just take a quick look. It was sent to Linux CBT SUSE 1. So let's actually log on to the remote system as simply Linux CBT SUSE 1, and you'll see that the message was redirected. And we will authenticate and launch mutt. And there's a new message from Linux CBT W2K, and that's simply because of an alias. So it was sent from Linux CBT W2K3 and relayed through our postfix server. So this tells us that the default configuration permits, at least based on our examination thus far, relaying from the local system, relaying into the local server, and relaying from clients that match our subnet, because again, if we run postconf, pipe it to less, and examine the my destination as well as the various other parameters such as the my networks, you'll see that we trust the local loopback network. We also trust our local subnet. Now, if you want to tighten this up, simply remove the entries either using the postconf command or modifying the main.cf command directly. So let's make a quick change here. We'll nano main.cf. We'll find my networks, and we're going to change the style from subnet to host so that only the local system is permitted to route messages or to relay messages. So the default is defined as the subnet. It doesn't show up here, but it is defined, which means we need to undefine it by defining the variable. In other words, the default is local loopback network 127 and the local subnet. So what we should do is simply change the my network style, just uncomment this section to be host, and this simply means that only the local host is able to relay messages out through this machine. Let's save the changes, and we'll execute a postfix reload, at which point we will rerun postconf and pipe it to less, and now the my networks and the my networks style that was defined prior is now set to the local host. Notice it shows the loopback adapter, and it also shows the explicit IP address of this local server /32 bits. So if we don't match either of these masks, then we're unable to relay. Now we should just confirm that before we move on to other things relay. Let's create a message, and we'll send it first to the user linuxcbt SUSE1 at linuxcbt work1.linuxcbt.internal. This will request a relay from our server. Testing relay with subnet disabled. And when we attempt to send, this message attempted to send through the remote system. And let's take a quick look at the remote system to see what it accepted. We'll tail var log mail, and you'll see what happened here was the message was actually accepted from 192.168.1.50, and it was sent to Linux CBT SUSE1 at linuxcbt work1.linuxcbt.internal. The status is sent, so it was actually relayed through to the remote system. Now let's attempt to send a message to an outside host. We'll send a message to linuxcbt SUSE1 at linuxcomputerbasetraining.com, and we'll test it. And now this returns an error. Again, we're attempting now to leave the local subnet, and our remote system's not permitting it. So big difference, we can't route this message outbound. Relaying is restricted, and if we re-examine, you'll see that it gives an error, relay access denied, to send the message outbound. On the local subnet, no problem. Let's compose a new message again. We'll send it to Linux CBT Suzy1 at Linux CBT work1.linuxcbt.internal. We'll say test 2 of relaying, and now it bounces. Now this is the other message that is, but the message on the local subnet went through, but the message to leave the local subnet did not. So postfix it's pretty flexible with respect to relaying. So next we're going to take a look at more things we can do with relaying and different ways we can control the relaying process.